Have you ever wondered why actors in old black and white photographs often stand so far apart? The answer is simple. Many icons of the golden age smelled so bad that getting close to them without risking unconsciousness was nearly impossible. We have prepared a list of 10 untouchable legends who turned neglecting the shower into a personal manifesto and a supreme form of provocation. From the king's putrid breath to the alcohol-soaked costumes of Robin Hood, we are going to shake every skeleton out of closets reeking of mothballs and sweat. Welcome to the real Hollywood, a place that smells not of roses, but of human decay beneath a thick layer of makeup. But before we get to our first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit like, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show.
Clark Gable. In Hollywood's golden age, Clark Gable wasn't just an actor, he was an institution. Men copied his mustache and the way he wore a hat, while women literally fainted from a single squint of his eyes. He was called the King, and he sat on the MGM throne with unshakable confidence. Yet this greatness had a reverse side that biographers preferred not to mention for decades. Getting within arm's length of the king was like stepping into a gas chamber. His charisma was blinding, but his breath could knock flies out of the air. Gable's problem was not the result of simple carelessness. It was a full-blown medical catastrophe, carefully concealed by studio publicity departments. In 1933, just as his career was blasting into the stratosphere, Gable was struck by a severe case of pyorrhea, an advanced form of periodontal disease. The infection was so aggressive that doctors were forced to take drastic measures. At only 32 years old, Clark Gable had almost all of his teeth removed. For a sex symbol of that era, this was a professional death sentence. MGM went into panic mode. Gable was officially sent on a vacation to Canada, supposedly for rest and hunting, but in reality so he could recover from surgery and learn to live with massive dentures. The technology of the time was crude. His false teeth were bulky, fit poorly against his gums, and created the perfect breeding ground for bacteria. Food particles lodged in the gaps, while the metal and rubber bases reacted with saliva. The result was chronic halitosis of such intensity that it became legendary in studio back corridors. The most ironic and tragic episode of this story unfolded during the filming of the most iconic movie in cinema history, Gone with the Wind. While millions of viewers dreamed of being in Scarlett O'Hara's place, wrapped in Rhett Butler's arms, the actress playing her was enduring a private nightmare. Kissing Clark Gable in Gone with the Wind was anything but pleasant, Vivien Leigh later admitted. His dentures smelled absolutely horrifying. It was the smell of decay. Every time director Victor Fleming called action for another romantic scene, Leigh had to hold her breath. The situation was made worse by the fact that Gable, fully aware of his problem, sometimes joked about it. It was said that before kissing scenes, he would deliberately eat something especially pungent, like garlic or onions, adding extra punch to his already lethal stench. Leigh complained that he reeked of a sour, rotten odor that no amount of the most expensive colognes of the time could mask. What makes this story truly astonishing is Gable's pathological obsession with bodily hygiene. He was a man of extremes. He could take 4 or 5 showers a day. He was fanatical about clean bed linens, demanding that sheets in his home be changed daily, sometimes even twice a day. Clark even shaved his chest and armpits, an unheard-of practice for a rugged macho of that era, claiming that body hair trapped sweat and made him smell like an animal. But this fastidiousness had a strange, almost unhinged quirk. Gable flatly refused to take baths. He found the very idea of sitting in stagnant water utterly revolting. "I'm not going to marinate in my own filth," he declared. "Only showers, only running water." But no amount of soap could fix what was happening inside his mouth. As the years passed, the situation only grew worse. On the set of It Started in Naples in 1960, his co-star was the radiant Sophia Loren. Accustomed to European elegance and attention to detail, she was reportedly shocked. Stories circulated that Lauren kept Gable at arm's length whenever the cameras stopped rolling. Gable seemed to develop a defense mechanism. He simply ignored the problem. He refused to use medicated mouthwashes, which were just coming into fashion at the time, dismissing them as unmanly and disruptive to his acting focus. He believed his natural magnetism would overpower any physical shortcomings. By the end of his life, Gable became a prisoner of his own image. The great seducer whose voice made millions tremble was forced to watch colleagues involuntarily wince when he came too close. His story is a textbook example of the Hollywood facade: a perfect profile, an impeccable suit, smooth-shaven skin, and the smell of a trash bin that accompanied every breath he took. He died in 1960, leaving behind the title of the King of Hollywood, a crown no one ever truly challenged. But for those who worked with him closely, he was remembered not as a great romantic hero, but as a man whose presence was detected by the nose long before his figure appeared in the doorway. Gable proved that you can be an idol of generations, even if your breath is powerful enough to suffocate a screen goddess.
Marilyn Monroe. If Clark Gable was a victim of medicine, Marilyn Monroe was a victim of her own chaos. The most desired woman on the planet, whose image was associated with champagne bubbles, white silk, and the scent of Chanel No. 5, was in reality a walking paradox. While the world dreamed of catching a single glance from her, those who shared her daily life dreamed of only one thing: to throw every window wide open. Beneath the porcelain skin and platinum curls lay a slovenliness bordering on the pathological. Marilyn's home was her fortress, though that fortress looked more like an abandoned food warehouse. Maids hired by the star rarely lasted longer than a couple of months. The reason was simple. The platinum blonde had a habit of turning her bed into a dining table. Monroe adored eating in bed, completely naked, savoring the feeling of freedom. But any notion of table manners was entirely absent. She might order a luxurious steak, burnt toast, or pasta, eat half of it, and then simply brush the leftovers under the sheets or leave them on the nightstand for days. Actor Peter Lawford recalled that her bedroom was filled with the heavy stench of stale food mixed with expensive perfume, creating a nauseating blend. Crumbs, olive pits, dried sauces, all of it became part of her bed's peculiar landscape. When she woke up, she could lie back down in those same filthy sheets without seeing any problem at all. In 1950s Hollywood, standards of cleanliness were strict, but Marilyn considered herself above such conventions. She bathed or showered extremely rarely. Some biographers link this to her deep depressions. When the black days came, she simply didn't have the strength to make it to the bathroom. Yet even during periods of emotional lift, she ignored the most basic rules. No deodorant. Monroe refused to use antiperspirants on principle. She believed the natural scent of the body was part of her sexuality. Under the scorching California studio lights, however, that natural scent quickly turned into sharp, sour sweat. Hair hygiene. Her legendary platinum curls were the result of aggressive bleaching that turned her hair to straw. To keep it from falling apart, she caked it with thick layers of baby powder and hairspray, leaving this crust in place for weeks without washing. Her makeup artist, Whitey Snyder, who worked with her for many years, became a true master of camouflage. He always kept mountains of wet wipes, ice to reduce swelling, and liters of powder. His task was literally to scrape Marilyn free of yesterday's makeup and sweat so he could apply a fresh layer of cinematic glow. The most brutal collision of two worlds occurred on the set of The Misfits. Clark Gable, who as we know suffered from halitosis himself but was obsessed with bodily cleanliness, was horrified by Monroe's habits. He complained that she smelled like an old attic and an unwashed body. Gable, whose breathing problems made him extremely sensitive to odors, refused any romantic advances toward Marilyn off-set. To him, she was a dirty girl whose beauty ended where the sense of smell began. Actor Tony Curtis, who starred with her in the legendary Some Like It Hot, once caustically remarked that kissing her was like kissing Hitler.
Though he meant her temperament and chronic lateness, many on the crew took it literally. Breathing beside her during long takes was physically difficult. Even her lovers, willing to forgive her much, sometimes faltered. One of them recalled that her room smelled of sweat, anxiety, and old wine. She could go days without changing her underwear if it felt comfortable, and her famous silk dresses often bore yellow stains under the arms, which costumers had to remove with liters of gasoline and ether. By the early 1960s, the situation became critical. To her physical uncleanliness added the smell of medication and alcohol. Marilyn took enormous quantities of barbiturates, which affected her metabolism. Those who were near her in the final months of her life described her aura as the smell of decay. This was no longer mere slovenliness, but a manifestation of her inner collapse. Beneath layers of lip gloss, tight corsets, and diamonds hid a woman who had lost faith in herself so completely that she stopped caring for the most basic shell, her own body. Marilyn Monroe went into history as an ideal of beauty, but that ideal was created in spite of reality. She was a dirty angel who smelled not of roses, but of human weakness, laziness, and a forgotten steak rotting under a pillow in a luxurious room at the Bel Air Hotel.
Errol Flynn. If a device for measuring alcohol vapors in the air had existed in the 1940s, it would have exploded the moment Errol Flynn walked into the room. Flynn was the textbook adventurer, tall, athletic, with rakish mustaches and a gaze that promised women paradise and men a fight. But behind the fearless Robin Hood facade lurked a man whose blood was at least 1/3 gin, and it leaked out shamelessly through the pores of his skin. By the mid-1930s, Errol Flynn had gone far beyond merely having a drink. He turned alcoholism into an art form, and his body responded in kind. Colleagues on set recalled a peculiar, almost nuclear aroma that surrounded him. This was not just the smell of stale breath, it was a thick, sticky stench of gin seeping out with his sweat. When Flynn entered a dressing room, the air instantly grew heavy and intoxicated. People joked that if someone struck a match, Flynn would go up like an Olympic torch. His metabolism was so saturated with alcohol that the deodorants of the era, ineffective to begin with, surrendered within the first 5 minutes. The most miserable people at Warner Brothers were the costume designers. Flynn adored historical swashbucklers that required heavy doublets, tight silk tights, and leather jerkins. Under blazing studio lights or the California sun on location, Errol sweated like a dock laborer. By 11 in the morning, the silk collars of his shirts would turn yellow and soak up the sour smell of fermented juniper, the backbone of gin. The situation became so unbearable that the studio took unprecedented measures. Special costumes were commissioned for Flynn, with removable inner panels under the arms and along the back. These were swapped out several times a day so the actor wouldn't look on camera as though he had just climbed out of a vat of liquor. Dry cleaners couldn't cope. Stories circulated that Flynn's clothes had to be literally soaked in vinegar and special chemical solutions to kill that stubborn stench of decay and perpetual debauchery. Flynn had a difficult temperament and loved to shock people. From time to time, he would declare a hygiene boycott. He could go weeks without showering, claiming that a real man should smell of horse, leather, and adventure. In reality, it was the smell of dirty socks and unwashed flesh, generously doused in cheap cologne to somehow mask the reek of gin-soaked sweat. His breath deserves a separate mention. A blend of strong tobacco, gin, and stomach problems produced an effect his frequent co-star Olivia de Havilland called a test of professional loyalty. A true lady, Olivia never criticized him openly, but she always kept an open bottle of mint mouth rinse in her dressing room, gently offering it to Errol before every kissing scene. Strangely enough, he listened only to her, though he would grumble that clean breath was a sign of a boring man. By the 1950s, the great seducer had become a shadow of himself.
His liver was in dreadful condition, which showed in his complexion and, inevitably, in his smell. His skin took on a grayish-yellow hue and began to exude the odor of medicine and old alcohol. The stench in his dressing room was so overpowering that young actresses refused to enter it for rehearsals. He died at 50, and the pathologists were stunned. His internal organs looked as though they belonged to a very old man. Errol Flynn lived at full throttle, paying no attention to such trifles as soap and sobriety. He left behind dozens of magnificent films and the legend of a Robin Hood who could defeat any enemy except the smell of his own self-destruction.
Wallace Beery. If the previous figures on our list at least had medical or psychological excuses for their fragrance, Wallace Beery was unique in his simplicity. He did not suffer from gum disease, nor did he drown his sorrows in gin. He simply, sincerely, almost dogmatically despised water. Beery was one of MGM's biggest box office stars of the 1930s, an Oscar winner and a public favorite known for playing lovable working men and gruff-hearted softies. Off-camera, however, this good fellow was so foul-smelling that his arrival at the studio was compared to the approach of a herd of unwashed bison. Wallace Beery was a man of the old school, shaped by circus troupes and traveling theater companies. He believed daily bathing was a form of softness unworthy of a real man. At MGM, where glamour was elevated to a religion, Beery was a living anomaly. While other actors spent hours on manicures and hairstyling, Wallace could show up on set in clothes he hadn't taken off for days, with grime under his nails that he proudly referred to as a working man's patina. His personal stench was complex and almost tangible. Witnesses described it as a dense cocktail whose base note was the smell of old human sweat soaked into his massive body over the years. The middle notes carried the acrid tang of yesterday's cigars. He smoked constantly, careless of where the ash fell, while the lingering trail reeked of stale coffee and cheap diner food. People joked that you could sense Beery in the hallway a full 2 minutes before he turned the corner. Colleagues quite literally scattered when they heard his heavy footsteps, and directors tried to give instructions from the greatest possible distance. For any actress, the greatest tragedy was ending up in the same frame with Beery, or worse, in the same makeup trailer. Jean Harlow, the platinum blonde and an icon of pristine glamour, once threw a genuine fit at studio management. She demanded that Beery's makeup station be moved as far away from her chair as possible, insisting that his presence made her dizzy and that the smell seeped into her costumes. MGM's wardrobe department treated working with Beery like penal labor. Unlike Gable or Monroe, who wore delicate silks, Beery often appeared in coarse wool, leather, and heavy jackets. Under the studio lights, these costumes became portable greenhouses. Beery refused to take them off during breaks, sweating in them for hours, then simply hanging them back up for the next day. By mid-shoot, his wardrobe smelled so bad that assistants entered his dressing room with their noses pinched shut or their faces wrapped in scarves soaked with cologne. Most astonishing of all, Beery felt no embarrassment whatsoever about his odor. On the contrary, he used it as a tool of dominance. He knew the studio paid him obscene sums of money and considered himself untouchable. When directors delicately hinted that perhaps a bath was in order, he would only roar with laughter and declare that audiences loved him for his authenticity. In his mind, smelling like a vagrant meant being close to the people. During the filming of The Champ, the role that earned him his Oscar, his young co-star Jackie Cooper later recalled that working with Wallace was physically exhausting. The actor not only smelled terrible, but behaved with extreme slovenliness, wiping greasy hands on his costume or spitting on the floor in the middle of rehearsal. Wallace Beery lived a long life by the standards of his time and died in 1949 a multimillionaire. He left behind a vast fortune and dozens of films in which he appears as a cozy grandfatherly figure. But behind that screen image lay a truth no strip of film could convey. This man turned filth into a manifesto.
He was living proof that in Hollywood's golden age, box office revenue could justify any stench. If you brought the studio millions, you earned the right to smell like a garbage dump, and everyone, from makeup assistants to legendary actresses, would be forced to choke, smile to your face, and try not to faint from your royal aroma.
John Barrymore. John Barrymore was not merely an actor, he was flesh of the flesh of America's greatest theatrical dynasty. He was known as the Great Profile for his flawless, almost classical features, and his Hamlet was considered the definitive performance for decades. But by the early 1930s, that aristocratic grandeur began to rot from the inside under the pressure of monstrous amounts of alcohol. What had started as bohemian indulgence turned into a biological catastrophe. Barrymore ceased to be a symboled high art and became a walking monument to human decay. Each year, the air in his dressing room grew heavier, acquiring a distinct sour note that unmistakably betrayed a body no longer capable of processing its own poisons. This was no longer the scent of fine cognac in an exclusive club, but the stench of a cheap flockhouse, its walls soaked in the vapors of hopelessness. By the mid-1930s, Barrymore's hygiene had become a running legend among studio employees. Assistants and aides who were forced into his personal space described his individual aroma as a nauseating cocktail. The base note was spilled, stale gin consumed in staggering quantities. To somehow mask the alcohol on his breath before going on set, John would shovel mint lozenges into his mouth by the handful, but this only produced an even stranger and more unpleasant effect. The most disturbing element was what colleagues called the smell of old bandages, a specific odor of unwashed flesh and worn-out clothing. Barrymore could wear the same silk shirts for weeks, their collars turning gray from sweat and flakes of skin. He literally sweated alcohol, and no powder or cologne could conceal the fact that the Great Profile was slowly becoming a living corpse. Working with Barrymore in his later years turned into a refined form of torture for directors and co-stars alike. Due to alcohol-induced brain damage, known as wet brain, he could no longer memorize his lines. Huge cue cards were hung all over the set, but even reading from them he struggled to focus his eyes. His breath during this period was so saturated with alcohol fumes that actresses tried not to face him during dialogue scenes, fearing contact intoxication or simply fainting from the sharp stench. Studios attempted to disguise his decline by flooding his dressing room with liters of French perfume, but the smell of rot was stronger. In his final years, he was essentially playing himself, fallen drunks and forgotten idols, and it was the most tragic spectacle in Hollywood history because these roles required almost no makeup. John Barrymore died in 1942 at the age of 60, ravaged by cirrhosis of the liver and kidney failure. His death was as unkempt as his final years, in debt, surrounded by empty bottles and the smell of abandonment. Doctors who examined his body noted that it had been worn down to an extreme degree. He left behind the legend of a great talent sacrificed to the green serpent and a lingering trail of bitter decay that haunted those who remembered him at the height of his fame. The Great Profile was finally erased, leaving only the memory of a man who smelled like a shattered gin bottle forgotten in the dusty corner of an old theater.
Tallulah Bankhead. Tallulah Bankhead was chaos draped in furs and pearls. The daughter of a powerful Speaker of the House, a true Southern aristocrat, she possessed a voice that sounded like ice cracking in a glass of whiskey. Yet behind this blue-blooded facade lay a total, almost militant disregard for basic hygiene. Tallulah wore her stench like a badge of honor, convinced that her status and talent allowed her to ignore such earthly trifles as soap and water. When close friends or stunned colleagues delicately hinted at the heavy odor surrounding her, she would merely release a regal cloud of cigarette smoke and deliver her famous line, "Darling, I don't sweat, I glow."
For makeup artists and costumers, however, this so-called glow was a biological ordeal that made them want to flee the room at once. Bankhead's approach to self-care was highly specific. She preferred camouflage to cleansing. Tallulah literally bathed in expensive lavender powder, applying it layer upon layer to conceal the fact that she would go for days without taking a bath. The result was a dense, suffocating cloud composed of dried lavender, stale gin, and the unmistakable scent of a body long deprived of a washcloth. Makeup artists working with her struggled to suppress their gag reflex when they had to lean close to her face. To this bouquet was added the persistent smell of old silk. Tallulah adored her luxurious outfits, but had them cleaned extremely rarely, so the fabric absorbed her personal aroma so deeply that the dresses seemed to take on a life of their own. The film crew experienced true shock during the production of Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat in 1944. Staying true to her habit of scandalizing everyone around her, Tallulah declared a personal war on underwear and abandoned it entirely for the duration of the shoot. Given the nature of the film, the actors were confined to the cramped space of a boat, with the camera often at low angles. This became a catastrophe for cinematographers and lighting technicians. When Hitchcock was told about the actress's excessive frankness and the accompanying smells trapped inside the set, he replied dryly, "I'm not sure whether to call the police or the sanitation department." To the fumes of alcohol and tobacco tar was added the odor of an unwashed body in conditions of constant dampness, turning work on the lifeboat into a torture chamber for everyone involved. By the 1960s, the Broadway and Hollywood legend began to literally decay beneath the weight of her own glamour. Alcohol and substance abuse made her voice even raspier, while her personal scent became a mixture of medicinal breath and a body that could no longer pretend to be healthy. She lived amid disorder, empty bottles, and clouds of powder, convinced to her final breath that the rules of hygiene were shackles for ordinary mortals, but not for Tallulah Bankhead. She died leaving behind a trail of scandals, great roles, and the aroma of the most honest and most unpleasant rebellion against cleanliness Hollywood had ever known. Beneath the lavender lay a woman who never learned to love soap, but forced the world to inhale the scent of her vanity.
Charles Bronson. Charles Bronson was an icon of tough guys, a man with a face seemingly carved from granite and fists the size of beer mugs. On screen, his characters radiated harsh charisma. On set, they radiated something far more tangible and far more caustic. Bronson pushed the concept of a natural masculine scent to a frightening extreme. In the early 1960s, while filming classic westerns in the blistering deserts of Utah, he decided that total immersion in the role of a cowboy required him to merge with nature in the most literal way possible. This meant a complete rejection of water-based hygiene. While other actors, after grueling days under the merciless sun, rushed to the showers to wash off sweat and road dust, Bronson demonstratively ignored the camp's shower stalls, dismissing them as a luxury unworthy of a real man. The consequences of this decision were catastrophic for everyone around him. After a full day of horseback riding, with temperatures soaring past 30 degrees Celsius even in the shade, Bronson turned into a biological weapon. Clint Walker, who worked alongside him, later recalled that Charles emitted such a heavy, dense stench it seemed to have its own color and shape. It was the smell of old sweat soaked deep into skin and clothing, mixed with horsehair and centuries-old dust. Bronson saw no problem in this. He would simply take off his filthy shirt, put on a clean one, which became dirty again within 10 minutes, and consider his hygiene ritual complete. In the confined spaces of shooting trailers, his presence made colleagues physically nauseated, yet no one dared confront a man who looked as though he could kill with a glance. If the desert wind at least partially carried the smell away, filming indoors or on poorly ventilated sound stages turned working with Bronson into outright torture. Co-stars tried to memorize their lines so they could deliver them on a full exhale just to avoid breathing the air near Charles.
Matters were made worse by the fact that Bronson frequently suffered from skin irritations and rashes caused by constant grime, but instead of simply washing, he slathered the affected areas with foul-smelling medicinal ointments. This cocktail of medical fumes and week-old sweat produced an effect lighting technicians jokingly called the breath of a skunk. The actor stubbornly insisted that cleanliness was a sign of softness and that a true Western hero should smell strong enough for enemies to sense him from miles away. For Bronson, refusing to wash was not mere laziness, but part of a personal philosophy. He genuinely believed that pheromones and natural odors made his performances more authentic and his on-screen presence more dominant. He despised colognes, dismissing them as feminine nonsense, and even at social events sometimes allowed himself to look and smell as though he had just stepped off a cattle drive. Beneath the mask of the invincible hero, there was a man who made entire film crews dream of gas masks. Charles Bronson remains a symbol of unbreakable will in cinema history, but for those who shared cramped sets with him, he was forever the desert skunk, a man whose masculinity was directly proportional to his unbearable stench.
W.C. Fields. The great comedian W.C. Fields turned his alcoholism into part of his stage persona, transforming the image of a perpetually drunk curmudgeon into a gold mine. What made audiences laugh in movie theaters, however, brought tears and gagging to those who stood on the same side of the camera with him. Fields didn't merely drink, he existed inside a dense, invisible cocoon of alcoholic fumes. By the 1940s, his body was so saturated with gin and whiskey that he no longer needed perfume. His personal scent was recognizable from dozens of meters away. Paramount studio assistants recalled that they could pinpoint exactly where Fields was in the soundstage simply by sniffing the draft. It was a thick, sour, crushing odor, blending stale alcohol breath, cheap tobacco, and a kind of human exhaustion no soap could ever wash away. Fields's costumes were both his pride and his curse. Despite being fabulously wealthy and fully capable of affording the finest wardrobe, W.C. had a peculiar attachment to his clothes and could wear the same jacket for weeks without sending it to be cleaned. Under the blazing studio lights, the wool absorbed everything: sweat, spilled gin, cigarette ash, and crumbs of food. By the middle of the shooting day, such a stench wafted from his sleeves that his co-stars developed special breathing techniques. They timed their lines so as not to inhale deeply whenever Fields began gesturing energetically nearby. Working with him was like standing inside a massive wine barrel that hadn't been washed in years and had been left baking in the sun. Camouflage that only made things worse. Aware of his reputation, Fields occasionally attempted to freshen up, but he did so in his own inimitable fashion. Instead of taking a shower, he drenched himself in liters of the harshest, cheapest cologne he could find. The result was an even more monstrous cocktail, a clash of floral notes with the acrid stench of gin-soaked sweat and unwashed clothes. Assistants often flung open the windows before his arrival, hoping to thin the fog at least a little, but Fields's smell was truly monumental. He called gin the breakfast of champions and hid bottles everywhere, from hollow canes to thermoses labeled tea, and this constant refueling ensured that his personal cloud never dissipated. By the end of his life, Fields became a hostage to his habit. His nose took on that infamous purplish hue and porous texture typical of advanced alcoholism, and his breath grew so ferocious that people avoided sharing an elevator with him. He died on Christmas Day in 1946, a holiday he always despised, completely alone, surrounded by the same persistent odor of alcohol and old fabric. W.C. Fields left behind a brilliant humor, but in the history of Hollywood's golden age, he remains the man who turned his life into an endless bender and his smell into an impenetrable wall between himself and the rest of the world. Judy Garland.
Judy Garland, whom the world worshipped as the radiant Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, was in reality a deeply unhappy woman whose body became a battlefield between studio ambitions and her own inner demons. By the early 1950s, when she was filming A Star is Born, her condition had become critical. This was not a conscious disregard for cleanliness, as in the case of Wallace Beery. It was the smell of absolute exhaustion. Judy could arrive on set in wrinkled clothes, with greasy hair and a gaze that failed to focus on anything. A sharp, sickly scent clung to her, a mixture of accumulated stress, strong cigarettes, and peculiar chemical note caused by the enormous quantities of pills she was taking, barbiturates and amphetamines she had been put on as a child. During this period, Garland's dressing room carried a persistent, suffocating odor. It was a cocktail of cold cleansing cream she did not always wash off, heavy tobacco smoke she chain-smoked relentlessly, and that unmistakable smell of frayed nerves, the sticky sweat of someone living in constant fear of ruining a shoot or forgetting her lines. At times, depression overwhelmed her so completely that she physically could not bring herself to step into the bathroom. Costume assistants, seeing the state the star was in, performed a quiet, daily act of mercy. They secretly sprayed her dresses with strong perfume and stitched in fresh linings, trying to preserve at least the illusion of Hollywood glamour and protect the dignity of the woman who had once been America's golden girl. Working with Garland in her later years was both an emotional and physical ordeal. Her breath was often soaked with alcohol, which she used to wash down her pills, creating a volatile mixture that left scene partners lightheaded. Colleagues recalled that during rehearsals, she emanated a sense of something broken and unclean, not morally, but biologically. Judy's body simply could not process the toxins quickly enough, and they began to seep out through her skin. Against the backdrop of her divine voice, this odor of decay created a chilling contrast. On screen, the world saw a great actress. On set, the crew felt the presence of an exhausted human being slowly suffocating under the weight of her own legend and the endless expectations of the public. By the end of her life, Judy Garland had almost stopped caring for her appearance off stage. She carried the scent of someone no longer searching for salvation, only for rest. When she was found dead in a rented house in London in 1969, the surroundings merely confirmed her decline. Disorder, empty medicine bottles, and that same atmosphere of abandonment that had followed her through her final years. Hollywood remembers her forever as the voice of a generation, but those behind the scenes remembered how stardust turned into the smell of hopelessness, one that no perfume in the world could erase. She was an icon who burned out too quickly, leaving behind only the bitter scent of unfulfilled hopes and eternal fatigue. Humphrey Bogart. Our list concludes with Humphrey Bogart, the very embodiment of masculinity, whose squinting gaze and upturned trenchcoat collar became symbols of an entire era. Yet behind the image of the ultimate tough guy lurked a physiological nightmare for anyone who came closer than a meter. Bogart was a chain smoker, sometimes demolishing up to 3 packs of unfiltered cigarettes a day. His fingers were perpetually stained yellow with nicotine, but that was only half the problem. The real ordeal was his breath, a concentrated blend of tobacco tar baked into his lungs over decades and the byproducts of chronic gastritis. For his leading ladies, romantic scenes became tests of professional endurance, requiring not only simulated passion, but also a heroic battle against the gag reflex. The most famous screen couple in cinema history, Bogart and Ingrid Bergman in Casablanca, was far less romantic behind the scenes. While audiences wept during the farewell at the airport, Bergman was engaged in a private struggle for survival. Bogart's breath, saturated not only with tobacco, but with steady doses of whiskey he consumed to keep himself going, was so overpowering that Ingrid begged director Michael Curtis to minimize close-ups. She asked to be filmed at angles that kept her face out of his direct exhaust. The legendary line, "We'll always have Paris," was delivered inside a cloud of such dense fumes that after each take, Bergman discreetly stepped aside just to steal a breath of fresh air. During the filming of The African Queen in 1951, the situation reached its peak. While the entire crew suffered from dysentery in the jungle, Bogart and director John Huston proudly declared themselves the only healthy ones because they drank nothing but whiskey. That so-called sterility came at a price for everyone around them. Katharine Hepburn, known for her bluntness and love of cleanliness, diplomatically referred to the atmosphere on set as an aromatic challenge. Bogart didn't merely smell of alcohol, he radiated it. Add the heat, the humidity, and the fact that he stayed in his rumpled Charlie Allnut costume for weeks on end, and you had a man whose odor could have stopped a charging elephant. Bogart, however, only laughed at his colleagues' complaints, insisting that cleanliness was for extras and a leading man was supposed to smell like life. Unlike many other stars, Humphrey Bogart was fully aware of his problem, but categorically refused to change anything. He believed his lifestyle, whiskey, cigarettes, and nights spent in bars, was inseparable from who he was. Dental hygiene ranked somewhere near the bottom of his priorities, well after choosing the right brand of bourbon. He lived his life like a true noir hero and died at 57 from esophageal cancer, leaving behind a trail of blue-gray smoke and hard liquor. Bogart proved that one could be the most charming man in the world, even if one's breath resembled an old ashtray soaked in cheap alcohol. His legend outlived any case of halitosis, but memories of his deadly kisses still linger in the memoirs of his unfortunate leading ladies.
And so our parade of star-studded aromas comes to an end. We leave the walls of this crypt behind, carrying with us the shadows of the great ones, figures whose brilliance dazzled the eyes while their scent forced people to hold their breath. This walk along the reverse side of Hollywood's golden age is not merely an exercise in gossip or an attempt to tarnish legends. It is a cruel but necessary reminder that the screen gods worshipped by millions were made of the same flesh, sweat, and weakness as ordinary mortals. We are used to seeing them through layers of retouching, soft focus lenses, and the rapturous prose of studio publicists. We are used to believing that Marilyn Monroe smelled only of fresh roses, and that Clark Gable exuded success and expensive leather. Reality, however, was far more down to earth, and far more pungent. Behind every dazzling frame stood a daily struggle for survival. Costume designers battling corrosive sweat, makeup artists fighting unwashed skin, and scene partners enduring the suffocating breath of their idols. The entire dream factory system of that era functioned as a colossal machine of disguise. MGM, Warner Bros., and Paramount were not just film studios, they were gigantic laundries that scrubbed biographies clean, but could not always scrub the actors themselves. They created gods out of people who sometimes could not manage basic hygiene. And here lies the central irony. The cleaner and more untouchable the on-screen image, the more dirt and the more human, all too human qualities accumulated in its shadow. Smell as a symptom of the era. The stench surrounding the greats was not merely the result of laziness. For each of them it was a personal calling card. For Judy Garland and John Barrymore it was the smell of decay and addiction, a cry for help from bodies that could no longer withstand the pace and pressure. For Tallulah Bankhead and Wallace Beery it was the aroma of rebellion, an arrogant refusal to submit to the rules of civilized society. For Clark Gable, it was a medical tragedy hidden behind impeccable mustaches. These smells were more honest than their interviews and more real than their roles.
They reminded everyone that beneath layers of makeup, silk, and diamonds, there is always an ordinary human being, one who gets sick, grows tired, sweats, and slowly withers. Today, in the age of HD resolution and total image control, such stories feel almost savage. Modern stars are polished to a mirror shine. Their diets and hygiene are calibrated down to the millimeter. But along with the dirt and the smell, Hollywood also lost that primal, untamed charisma. The people we spoke about were real, in their genius and in their uncleanliness. They were not afraid to be unpleasant, if that was the price of their fame or their freedom. Let these 10 names remain in your memory, not merely as perfect images from glossy posters. Remember them as people who passed through the fire of the spotlights, leaving behind a trail of smoke, stale alcohol, sweat, and great art. In the end, time dissipates all smells, leaving only legends. But now, when you re-watch Casablanca or Gone with the Wind, you may find yourself instinctively wrinkling your nose, recalling the price at which those great moments were created. Welcome back to the world of the living, where soap is available to everyone, and gods are merely actors with bad teeth and unwashed linen.